I have spent decades studying how leverage works between nations, and I can tell you with certainty that leverage is never about raw power. It is about connections. Or more precisely, it is about the absence of connections. When a nation lacks connections to alternative markets, alternative infrastructure, alternative financial systems, and alternative trade partners, it becomes entirely dependent on whatever connections do exist. And whoever controls those existing connections controls the nation itself. For 80 years after Bretton Woods, Canada possessed connections almost exclusively to the United States. A single dominant trade partner, a single dominant market for resource exports, a single dominant infrastructure network through which Canadian goods reached the world, a single dominant financial system through which Canadian trade was settled. These connections were not random. They were deliberately maintained by American policy to ensure that Canadian economic activity could not flow anywhere except through American-controlled systems. American leverage over Canadian policy was never based on military superiority or cultural dominance. It was based on connectivity monopoly. Canada was connected to one system. That system was American. Therefore, Canadian behavior had to align with American preferences or risk losing the only connections that mattered. This was the architecture of control that had persisted since the post-war era began. Simple, elegant, and seemingly permanent. Mark Carney understood that destroying this architecture required something more sophisticated than confrontation or negotiation. It required connecting the dots that had deliberately been left disconnected. Every alternative connection that did not exist between Canada and the rest of the world was a deliberate gap maintained by the logic of American leverage. Close those gaps, and American leverage disappears. Not weakens, not diminishes, disappears entirely because the monopoly on which it depended no longer exists. What followed was the most systematic effort in modern history to connect a nation to the global economy through channels that bypassed a single dominant power. $1.2 trillion deployed not to attack American connections, but to create alternative ones. The strategy was not about replacing American systems with something better. It was about ensuring Canada had enough connections to enough different systems that no single system could be leveraged to control Canadian policy. This is where most analysts fail to grasp what actually happened. They frame it as Canada reducing dependence on the United States. They frame it as diversification of trade relationships. These framings are technically accurate, but strategically incomplete. What Carney accomplished was not reduction of dependence, it was elimination of leverage. Leverage requires that the leveraged party has no alternative. The moment alternatives exist and are operational, leverage evaporates regardless of how strong the leveraging party theoretically is. You cannot pressure someone who can simply walk to another door when you block the first one. The first connection Carney established was geographic. For 80 years, Canada's connection to global markets had run through geography controlled by American power. Trade with Europe required passage through the St. Lawrence Seaway, or transit through American ports. Trade with Asia required Pacific routing through waters where American naval presence was dominant. The only major shipping routes connecting Canada to global markets passed through or near American-controlled territory. This geographic bottleneck was the foundation of American leverage over Canadian trade policy. It meant that even if Canada developed relationships with European or Asian buyers, those buyers could not access Canadian goods without American geographic cooperation. American control over shipping routes gave Washington effective veto power over who could trade with Canada and on what terms. Churchill Port eliminated this geographic bottleneck permanently. $180 billion funded transformation of Churchill from seasonal outpost to year-round deepwater facility, positioned at the geographic heart of Arctic shipping routes that were becoming navigable as climate change opened passages that had been blocked for centuries. These routes passed entirely through Canadian territorial waters. No American geographic cooperation required. A cargo ship could now dock at Churchill, load Canadian wheat or minerals or manufactured goods, and sail directly to Hamburg or Shanghai or Mumbai without ever entering American waters or using American port facilities. The geographic connection between Canada and global markets no longer required American permission. This single connection eliminated the geographic dimension of American leverage entirely, but geographic connection alone was insufficient. Leverage operates through multiple dimensions simultaneously. Even if goods could physically reach global markets without American cooperation, those markets needed to be willing to receive them. Relationships needed to exist. Regulatory frameworks needed to be compatible. Financial settlement mechanisms needed to function. Each missing dimension represented a remaining point of leverage American power could exploit. The second connection Carney established was diplomatic and commercial. $244 billion in comprehensive trade agreements with the European Union did more than facilitate commerce. They created institutional connections between Canadian and European economies that operated independently of American influence. Canadian companies integrated into European defense supply chains. Canadian agricultural products gained preferential access to European markets. Canadian minerals and energy secured long-term contracts with European buyers. These connections were not casual or exploratory. They were deep, structural, and mutually beneficial. European companies invested heavily in Canadian supply relationships because Canadian resources were superior quality and Canadian infrastructure offered shipping advantages through Arctic routes. Canadian companies invested in European market understanding because European buyers offered premium prices and stable long-term demand. Both sides had strong economic incentives to maintain and deepen these connections, regardless of what happened between Canada and the United States. Bilateral agreements with ASEAN nations created parallel connections to the Asian market. 700 million consumers, combined GDP exceeding $4.8 trillion, growing demand for exactly the resources Canada possessed in abundance. These connections were established through formal trade agreements, but reinforced through actual commercial relationships that generated revenue and created institutional dependencies on both sides. The connection with China was established with particular strategic precision. Without endorsing China's political system or compromising Canadian values, Carney created economic connections that served both nations' interests. Chinese manufacturers gained access to Canadian critical minerals essential for technology production. Canadian exporters gained access to Chinese markets willing to pay competitive prices and honor long-term contracts. These connections operated independently of American diplomatic dynamics and persisted regardless of tensions between Washington and Beijing. Each diplomatic connection eliminated another dimension of American leverage. And when European buyers had established relationships with Canadian suppliers, American pressure on those buyers to avoid Canadian trade became ineffective because both parties had strong economic incentives to maintain the relationship. When Asian manufacturers depended on Canadian critical minerals for their production, American attempts to cut off Canadian mineral exports to Asia became strategically counterproductive because it would hurt American allies as much as American adversaries. The third connection Carney established was industrial. $280 billion funding critical minerals processing and advanced manufacturing created connections between Canadian raw materials and global demand for finished products that bypassed the American processing industry entirely. For 80 years, Canadian resources had been connected to global supply chains only through American processing capacity. Raw lithium extracted in Canada became battery materials only after crossing into American processing facilities. Raw rare earth elements became technology components only after American manufacturers added value. This connection pattern meant Canadian resources generated maximum value only when flowing through American systems. It gave American processors enormous leverage over Canadian resource policy because Canadian resource revenues depended on American industrial cooperation. Processing facilities built across Canada severed this connection entirely. Canadian lithium became battery-grade material domestically before ever reaching any market. Canadian rare earth elements became refined components through Canadian refineries. Canadian uranium became enriched fuel through Canadian enrichment facilities. The connection between Canadian resources and global demand no longer required American industrial participation at any stage. This industrial disconnection from American processing created something particularly significant. It made Canadian resources valuable without American cooperation. Previously, the raw value of Canadian minerals was modest because raw materials command low prices. Their value was unlocked only through processing, which had historically occurred in America. Now value was unlocked domestically. Canadian resources entered global supply chains as finished products worth orders of magnitude more than raw materials, and those finished products were connected directly to global buyers through Canadian ports and Canadian shipping routes. The fourth connection Carney established was financial. For 8 decades, Canadian international trade had been settled primarily through American financial systems, dollar-denominated contracts, American clearing mechanisms, financial infrastructure that gave the United States visibility into and influence over every significant Canadian trade transaction. This financial connection was perhaps the most subtle dimension of American leverage, but also one of the most powerful. When trade agreements with European and Asian partners included provisions for settlement in euros, yuan, rupees, and other currencies through non-American clearing systems, this financial connection was severed. Canadian exporters could receive payment for goods without that payment flowing through American financial infrastructure. Canadian importers could purchase goods from European and Asian suppliers without dollar conversion or American clearing fees. Each financial transaction that occurred outside American systems represented a reduction in American visibility and influence over Canadian economic activity. Collectively, as the volume of non-dollar settled trade grew throughout 2025, American financial leverage over Canadian policy diminished proportionally. By late 2025, the majority of Canadian trade with non-American partners was settling through alternative financial mechanisms. The financial connection that had given Washington insight into and influence over Canadian economic behavior was no longer the dominant pathway. The genius of Carney's strategy resided in its simultaneity. Each individual connection that was established, geographic through Churchill, diplomatic through trade agreements, industrial through processing facilities, financial through alternative settlement mechanisms, was insufficient alone to eliminate American leverage. Geographic connections without diplomatic relationships meant goods could physically reach markets but had no buyers. Diplomatic relationships without industrial connections meant buyers existed but had nothing to purchase. Industrial connections without financial mechanisms meant products existed but could not be paid for efficiently. Only when all four connections existed simultaneously did American leverage disappear. And that is precisely what the $1.2 trillion strategy accomplished. It did not partially address American leverage. It did not reduce American leverage from complete to substantial. It connected every dot that had been deliberately left disconnected, and in doing so rendered American leverage structurally impossible to maintain. By September 2025, these connections were operational. Canadian wheat flowed through Churchill to German buyers, paying in euros through European financial systems. Canadian lithium reached Asian battery manufacturers through Pacific ports, with contracts denominated in yuan settled through Chinese clearing mechanisms. Canadian rare earth elements served European technology companies through Atlantic shipping routes, with payment processed through non-dollar systems. Every trade flow operated through connections that bypassed American systems at every stage. The market response documented the transformation with remarkable clarity. Foreign direct investment in Canadian infrastructure jumped 340% as global capital recognized that Canada had constructed comprehensive alternative connectivity. Canadian wheat futures jumped 23% as European buyers competed for direct access. Potash prices spiked 31% as fertilizer companies secured supply agreements that operated entirely outside American systems. But the most revealing market signals came from American corporate testimony before Congress in December 2025. 147 business leaders testified over 3 days about the consequences of Canadian connectivity transformation. Ford cited $1.4 billion in losses as Canadian suppliers redirected production toward non-American customers who offered better terms and more stable relationships. GM closed 2 Michigan plants as Canadian component costs made continued manufacturing uneconomical relative to sourcing from non-American suppliers. These testimonies were not complaints about Canadian hostility. They were reports from American businesses that had operated for decades within a connectivity structure that guaranteed Canadian economic dependence on American systems. That structure no longer existed. Canadian suppliers were connected to enough alternative buyers that American demand was no longer essential to Canadian prosperity. The leverage that American buyers had exercised over Canadian suppliers for generations had disappeared because Canadian suppliers now had doors leading to multiple markets rather than a single American-controlled corridor. I want to emphasize what makes connectivity-based transformation irreversible in ways that policy-based transformation is not. Policies exist in the realm of political decisions and can be reversed when leadership changes. But connections, once established and proven economically beneficial, generate their own momentum. European companies that spent years integrating Canadian suppliers into their supply chains will not abandon those relationships because American policy becomes more accommodating. They invested time, money, and institutional capacity in those connections. Abandoning them means losing that investment. Asian manufacturers that secured long-term contracts for Canadian critical minerals will not terminate those agreements because Washington offers alternative suppliers. They built production capacity around Canadian supply reliability. Switching suppliers means disrupting production schedules and retooling manufacturing processes. The economic cost of disconnecting exceeds the economic cost of maintaining existing connections. Financial systems that processed Canadian trade in non-dollar currencies developed institutional expertise, regulatory frameworks, and operational capacity around those flows. Reverting to dollar settlement means rebuilding systems that now operate efficiently in alternative currencies. The operational cost of disconnection exceeds the operational cost of continuation. Each connection that was established became self-reinforcing through economic logic rather than political will. This is why the transformation is permanent. It does not depend on Canadian political leadership maintaining a particular strategic orientation. It does not depend on European or Asian governments sustaining particular trade policies. It depends on economic relationships that generate mutual benefit and become more valuable over time as institutional knowledge and operational efficiency accumulate. The dots that Carney connected were geographic, diplomatic, industrial, and financial. Each dot represented a connection that had been deliberately left disconnected by the logic of American leverage maintenance. Connecting all four simultaneously created a network through which Canadian economic activity could flow without touching American systems at any point. And a network, once operational and generating returns, persists because its participants have economic incentives to maintain it regardless of external political pressures. American leverage over Canadian policy had depended on connectivity monopoly. Canada was connected to one dominant system. That system was American-controlled. Therefore, Canadian behavior aligned with American preferences. This logic was unassailable as long as the monopoly held. The moment alternative connections existed and proved economically viable, the monopoly ceased to exist, and without the monopoly, leverage disappeared entirely. I have watched enough power transitions to recognize that the most permanent shifts occur not when one power defeats another, but when the conditions that made power possible cease to exist. American military power has not been defeated. American economic size has not diminished. But American leverage over Canadian policy has disappeared because the connectivity monopoly on which that leverage depended no longer exists. Canada is connected to too many alternative systems for any single system to exert controlling influence. History will record this transformation as the moment when Canadian economic sovereignty became structurally irreversible, not because of political decisions that could be reversed, but because of connections that cannot be efficiently disconnected. Every dot that was connected represents an economic relationship generating mutual benefit. Disconnecting any single dot reduces the efficiency of the overall network. Disconnecting all dots simultaneously would require accepting economic losses that no rational government could justify to its citizens. The leverage has disappeared, not weakened, not reduced. Disappeared. Because the dots that had been deliberately left unconnected for 80 years are now connected. And connected dots, generating economic returns for all participants, will remain connected regardless of what happens in Washington, Ottawa, or any other capital city. This is how leverage permanently ends, not through confrontation, but through connection. Not through defeat, but through the construction of alternatives so numerous and so economically beneficial that dependence on any single system becomes a choice rather than a necessity. Canada made that choice. The dots are connected, the leverage is gone, and what is connected cannot be efficiently disconnected when disconnection means destroying economic relationships that serve everyone involved.